and just such a life. Hi, everybody. Welcome back to the CCA Living Room. My name's Jason Silverman. I'm really grateful to have you here tonight for this very special event celebrating Oliver Sacks. And we have a kind of a good news, bad news scenario. The bad news is that Rick Burns has had a family emergency and couldn't join us. The very good news is we're going to be joined by Billy Hayes and Lisha New, along with Paul Barnes, to talk about the film. So it's going to be a fantastic conversation. I got to hear them both talk about the film at the Telluride Film Festival in 2019, and there will be a lot of great stories to tell. So thank you for joining us. I imagine that you loved this extraordinary film as much as I did and Paul did, and so we're really grateful to have the opportunity to talk about it in more depth. The Living Room is CCA's gift to Santa Fe and beyond. During this time of isolation, we're really grateful to be able to connect people using great films and great conversations. We've done about 40.
Is the Wi-Fi
already
at Hikes?
It's working.
Oh, Paul Barnes is not muted. We have decided to make all of this, or most of these events, free. If you would like to support what we're doing and keep the Living Room strong, please consider donating. I've just posted a donation offer. You can click on the Donate Here button. It will open in a new window, and you can ignore it until the end of the show, and then you can give at the end of the show. We would love to have your support. So thank you for considering that. I am now going to bring on our illustrious guests. starting with Billy Hayes. Billy is a nonfiction writer and photographer. His four books are Sleep Demons, Five Quarts, The Anatomist, and Insomniac City. He has a new book coming out called Sweat, which is a history of exercise, and one book of photography called How New York Breaks Your Heart. Find those books, please. He won a Guggenheim Fellowship for nonfiction, and has written for a number of periodicals. You know Billy from the film. He is Oliver Sacks' long-term time partner and is running the Oliver Sacks Foundation. Billy, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
And Lee Shin Yu it's great that we have her here because she's kind of to Rick Burns what Paul Barnes is to Ken Burns. The key collaborator. She's worked with Rick for 25 plus years now, made literally dozens of films. She won a Primetime Emmy Award for Outstanding Achievement in Editing for their seminal, groundbreaking, legendary work, New York, which is an 8-part documentary film. She also has worked with Jim Jarmusch, Spike Lee, Sarah Driver, Bill Moyers, Stanley Nelson, Thomas Lennon. She's a real fixture of the independent cinema scene. We're really grateful to have her here. And then, of course, our wonderful moderator, Paul Barnes. Where would the living room be without Paul? And Paul is in the dark now. We're having some connection problems with Paul. Paul is that dark square, which is the opposite of what he really is, which is a completely bright light. And Paul has won every documentary editing award imaginable. His credits include the Civil War, baseball, the Vietnam War, the Roosevelts, etc. He has been also a stalwart living room moderator. Thank you, Paul, for being here. Oh, okay. So Paul, I think, has just lost his connection. So I'm going to, oh, here he's back. So, Paul, are you back with us?
I think it's all right now.
Okay, good. Paul, I just finished an effusive introduction for you.
Oh, okay. My thing just conked out. So
okay, we can start with you in the dark, and we can focus on Billy and Lee.
There you go.
There you go.
Okay, good. So we're ready to go.
We are.
All right, good. Welcome to all of my good friends at CCA. I'm very excited that we've been able to obtain Oliver Sacks, His Own Life, Rick Burns' latest documentary. Very, very pleased that we were able to show it to you. As Jason explained, Rick was supposed to be the guest tonight, but some unfortunate circumstances didn't allow him to come. But instead, we have the wonderful Lee Shin Yu and Billy Hayes that Jason have introduced you. And the way I want to start this off, and maybe Lee Shin, you could start this off, is how did this film come about for Rick? Was it his idea? What was the genesis of the beginning of this film?
It wasn't his idea. We were in the midst of editing a film, kind of in a deep editing state. Middle towards the end of January 2015, he got a phone call. It was a friend of a friend, and was Kate Eggers, who called and say, Rick, who introduced herself as Oliver's, longtime, essentially chief of staff editor, and that we have news that Oliver has this, doesn't have long with us, had this diagnosis of cancer, and he wanted to share his story. Would you come and film? And it was like, no research, no fundraising, nothing, just picked up his crew, Buddy Squires, as you know, and just piled into Oliver's living room where Billy is. Kate was there, friends and family, and just sat down and had a conversation that went for 5 days straight, 9 in the morning till 6. And I was like, Rick, we have this other film. And he's like, yeah, but we have to do this. Yes, I know you have to do this. And he just disappeared for a year and immersed himself into Oliverland. And I was, unfortunately not there in person, but fortunately was, being the editor, you sit through the 5 days of dailies, and it was just remarkable. I, at the time, did not really know much about Oliver. Like most people, I knew him from the feature film Awakenings and knew that he was, this person who had done this amazing thing, recognizing people who seemed not here in this world to us, that they do still have an inner life. And it was just remarkable to see this kind of quirky, eccentric, but very witty, deep thinking, charming man just take hold of all of us 5 days in a row.
Right.
And we just kind of went from there. And,
gotcha. Just a quick question. How many hours did Rick film altogether in that 5 day period?
Like you say, 9 in the morning till 6, with a middle hour, 2 hour break where Billy and Oliver went swimming.
Oh,
that was a lunch break.
That's true.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Yeah. And maybe Billy can lead up to that point of where we got the phone call.
Yeah, I was on the other side of that phone call that Kate made to Rick's office. Oliver got his diagnosis January 15th, 2015, and that he had metastatic cancer and possibly as much as a year to live, but probably more like 6 to 8 months. As it happened, Oliver had just a few weeks before, like 3 weeks before, submitted to his publisher the manuscript for an amazing memoir called On the Move, which really covers his entire adult life. And so he just completed this manuscript, then got this terminal diagnosis. And in that interim, Oliver, who was very, pleased and proud of the book, would read portions of the book to friends who would visit, maybe for a drink or for dinner.
Yeah.
And there was a friend who said, Oliver, we should videotape you reading from this manuscript. You're so wonderful. That sort of was the genesis of the idea of Kate reaching out to Rick, seeing if he might come by and film. And before we knew it, within 2 weeks, I'd say, this entire film crew was in this apartment where I am now, and filming, as Li-Shin said, for a full week, morning till night. The only requirement Oliver had was that he was able to go swimming at 12 noon each day, so he'd have a break.
Yeah.
But throughout that period, it was as if Oliver was the host of an endless dinner party, a dinner party that went from morning till night for 5 days, charming this audience of friends and family and filmmakers, and this amazing filmmaking team, Rick Burns and his great team of filmmakers. Li-Shin in the background perhaps, but I know you're with us in spirit.
Right. I want to talk about a little bit, before we show the first clip, Li-Shin, correct me if I'm wrong, but, not that I've seen all of Rick's films, especially the recent ones, but this is a very, very different film for Rick and for you, because normally, especially, Rick is such a great writer, and it's always a historical subject, and there's usually tons and tons of narration. And with this film, it's really narrated by Oliver, Dr. Sacks, and his friends, essentially. So in terms of structuring the film, editing the film, putting it together, it was a completely different kind of challenge, I think, for both you and Rick. Can you talk a little bit about that, the kind of adjustments that both of you had to make because it was so kind of new and different for Rick?
Yeah, it was a struggle in the beginning because, Rick is very passionate and strong ideas, and, the story needs to build in the arc and reveal and, surprise. And so all of those things that in a historical documentary, you can, in a way, you have some more control over how that is revealed. Right. And here, our material is essentially Oliver telling his life. And, when I first saw the dailies, my first instinct was, oh, we should just follow how the 5 days unveil itself. Uh-huh. But in the end, I think, Rick's strong sense of storytelling had to be, had to work with that, in that, because Oliver would go on tangents, yes. Lovely tangents, and sometimes they work and sometimes they don't. For example, right. His little thing about, his elements and his periodic tables, and, that was just lovely, but it had to sit in the right place.
Right.
So that in the end, I think we felt that the story still had to be told chronologically, so that you understand the events in his life, how it changed him, impacted him, and made him who he is, who he became, and the why he was able to do what he did all his life. Right. So it was a combination of that very rigorous, script writing, the beautiful language that he would have was then combined to become like it's Oliver is also a beautiful writer. So I think that kind of synergy, eventually we were able to kind of find the path forward. Gotcha. It was a struggle, to kind of understand how to work in a different way.
Yeah, exactly. Were there any moments of frustration where Rick really wanted to sit down and write some narration just to bridge everything, or was he so firm about Oliver telling his own story that he just resisted doing that? I'm just curious.
No,
knowing Rick a little bit and what a good
writer. No, definitely there were times where you just, when you couldn't figure out how to go from A to B, he was like, I could just write this line. We could just get over it. But in the end, we many of our partners were just encouraging us not to be seduced back to our old ways. Good. Hats off to all of them for encouraging us and pushing us. And, it's always, with every film, I find, you have to continue to push yourself. And yes, I think exactly. With this one, we definitely did, and certainly had a lot of help and consultation from others, Billy included, Kate, mm-hmm. and many of our other partners. So, right. We're really grateful for all of that input. Gotcha. To let us see what is possible.
Yeah, exactly. Well, to my mind, it worked out beautifully. I think let's look at the first clip I selected, which is actually it's a part of the intro. And in terms of these clip selections, just so you know, these all basically are scenes that kind of jumped out at me that I was particularly attracted to. And so this is a moment towards the very beginning of the film. Jason, you want to play clip number 1?
Much of my life has been spent trying to imagine what it's like to be another sentient being, what it's like to be a bat, what it's like to be an octopus, what it's like to be anyone else, for that matter, what it's like to be another human being. I mean, we all have our solitary consciousnesses. 18 months ago, I had a sense of wanting to complete my life, whatever that meant. And one thing was to try and look at it as a whole and articulate it, which I've tried to do here. Now, incidentally, are we on film? Was that on film?
Yes.
Good,
yes.
Okay, good.
Everything.
Good. Oh, yes, yeah. Let me introduce. There is Hallie, who is one of my helpers. here is invaluable, unique Kate, who has been my editor, collaborator, friend, and ghostwriter for many years. And somewhere or other, Billy? Right here. Oh, there you are. Here is Billy, who is a fellow writer and who lives in the building, and to whom I dedicate the present book.
A few things really strike me about that scene, and why I like it is, first of all, it starts off with, Oliver saying, I've always tried to imagine myself as another sentient being, and what Rick and Buddy did was that wonderful shot that goes across the octopuses, and then you see that beautiful photograph of Dr. Sachs, behind it, with, I believe, an octopus T-shirt on. And it's one striking thing in the film that I really noticed is that rather than using photographs kind of full frame, often Rick and Buddy put them into the locations, into situations, and then allow them to be a part of a little scene where there's objects and photos. And it's something that's new and different, I think, in Rick's approach, and something I appreciated throughout the entire film. The other thing I love is the fact that I can't remember ever seeing cinema verite style scenes where the camera is just kind of exploring the room and what's going on, and just following Dr. Sachs's lead in when he wants to introduce everybody, and the camera then follows around and you see each individual, and then he's searching for Billy and the camera finally finds Billy, which is a really wonderful moment. And the other thing I love about it is again, not knowing much about Dr. Sachs myself or his story, not realizing the relationship that Dr. Sachs and you had, Billy. Right. But at the very end of the scene, it's mentioned that the book that he's writing is dedicated to you. Right. And so, Li-Shin, in terms of the editing, what I love is that often you come back to that cinema verite scene in Dr. Sachs's apartment at periodic moments. And often Billy is present there, or there's some interaction that goes on. And so Billy, you're kind of presented as a kind of supporting player in a certain way, but the audience begins to think, oh, there may be something more here. especially since his last book is dedicated to you. Right. And one of the things I love about the film is that it's not revealed until close to the end of the film that the two of you had a relationship. Right. And so it's beautifully seated, Li-Shin, in terms of the editing throughout the film in a really lovely way. Li-Shin, do you want to talk about that? Just how you kind of intercut those cinema verite scenes with other material?
Yeah, it was something definitely Rick talked about. It's sort of like we need to see this because it's something. None of us knew that. Rick going in didn't know Oliver was gay, right? And so it was something that we felt it was an experience that it needed to be shared and needed to be carried through in the film. So. Yes. It's like we needed to know that he had this terminal diagnosis, and we need to sort of see this, crucial person in Oliver's life and the use of photographs sort of in an environment is something we've started to do more and more, particularly for the last one we did on the Chinese Exclusion Act. Sort of, understanding photograph and documents are witnesses to history, so to speak, So they were there when these events happened. So we wanted them to be situated not as a always as a two-dimensional image that you can pan and zoom and just sort of use as a two-dimensional object, but they are three-dimensional. They were a lived item, I feel like Oliver is reverberating in my head, objects and things have their life and are so important. So it's kind of trying to combine that and finding the moments and wanting to see the idea that this is a film that, you know, we followed over a course of 5 days.
Right.
And to understand the interaction. And also often Oliver is reading from his book and you hear the pages turning, right? So if you're trying to hide that, it's almost impossible. Right. And the delivery of when he's talking, when he's reading is obviously different. So as opposed to initially we were trying to hide that and it was just like, it's just too stiff and awkward. Yes. So it's realizing, okay, embrace it and make it a part of an element of the structure. So it was kind of.
I'm just curious with Oliver's readings from the books. Were they done during that 5-day period, or was this something that Rick went back and did later?
It was all
during
there.
the 5-day period. All there. Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Were those Dr. Sachs's recommendations, or did Rick have a chance to choose some of that material that he read? It was all Dr. Sachs.
I think Oliver had them printed out, right? Billy, you might know better how the process of what he decided, what chapters he wanted to read and share.
Yeah.
I think it's really important to understand how spontaneous this filmmaking really was in that first.
Yeah.
It really was on the fly, and we were so lucky to have Rick Burns and his whole team filming. The important thing to remember is this amazing manuscript that Oliver had just completed, which almost serves like a rough script for the film. Now, of course, that was not intentional, but I do especially love that clip you showed because it unfolded in real time what it was like for Oliver as he was beginning to adjust to the fact that he was coming out as a gay man publicly for the first time. He's 81 in that scene.
Right.
And, in the book itself, in the manuscript, he does talk about his sexuality over his lifetime and his relationship with me. But that doesn't, the relationship with me doesn't come until the end of the book. So it's really reflecting the book in a certain way that at the beginning of the film, he's still struggling to find the words to introduce me, not as his partner, not as his lover or boyfriend. He's still sort of struggling and introduces me as a fellow writer who lives in the building. You know, he gets a little clutched up, even though in the manuscript it's all already there. And then by the end of the film, he's able to talk about the two of us more candidly. And yes, he had the entire manuscript printed out in very large type. Oliver was blind in one eye from his cancer and had very poor vision in the other eye. So it was very large type printed out so he could read easily from the manuscript.
Right. I gotcha. Also, Li-Shin, stylistically, I think that Rick and Buddy, you know, made some wonderful choices of how to shoot recreations, especially. They're very, very striking in the way in which they're done in the film, and how, you know, along with, you know, using the photographs and how to frame them in situ, right, as living objects in the environments that he's creating. Do you know how Rick came up with some of? Well, actually, maybe let's look at the clip first. Let's look at Jason. If you could play clip number 2, let's take a look at that. It's about Michael's madness, which is full of amazing images, and then we'll talk about it after.
My brother Michael and I were evacuated together and spent 18 months at a hideous boarding school in the Midlands. We were bullied, we were beaten, and I think the circumstances did something to push my brother Michael towards psychosis. Soon after this, when he was 15, Michael became psychotic. He was diagnosed as schizophrenic. He could no longer sleep or rest. but agitatedly strode to and fro in the house, stamping his feet, glaring, hallucinating, shouting. I became terrified of him, for him, of the nightmare which was becoming reality for him. What would happen to Michael? And would something similar happen to me too?
The shadow of the brother was immensely powerful in his mind, the terror simply.
The effect on my parents was devastating. A sense of shame, of stigma, of secrecy entered our lives, compounding the actuality of Michael's condition. It was at this time that I set up my own lab in the house and closed the doors, closed my ears against Michael's madness. I felt a passionate sympathy for him, but I had to keep a distance also, create my own world of science so that I would not be swept into the chaos, the madness, the seduction of his.
Paul.
Such a wonderful portion.
Yeah.
Paul, you may
What?
be muted.
Oops, can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Oh, I'm sorry. I'll go back to where I started. I was just blown away by that sequence because I think it's so beautifully edited, but also beautifully photographed, but in a very, very unusual way. You know, things are out of focus. Things are super tight.
Mm-hmm.
Things are very, very close up. You've got a doorknob that's kind of a silhouette that's out of focus. You have just color flashes that run through. You have that stairway shot looking down when Michael's madness is being described. The way the photos often are, there's one photo on one side, one on the other, and you see the frames that split them apart. There's so many things. It's the little boy sitting in the hallway, which you assume is Oliver trying to escape into a book and away from his brother's madness. The lab objects are beautifully photographed. But again, there's a style to it which is so striking, and I'm just wondering, did Rick plan them out? What were his thoughts? Was it all improvisation? How much input did Buddy Squires, the cinematographer, have in it?
Yeah. I think, you know, I wasn't there, but I know that they had planned, they were going to be at Oliver's old home.
Yes.
So, you know, that was the location they were going to go film. And they were like, okay, the childhood, we want to depict, you know, what is the most, sort of one of the most striking seminal moment in his childhood was his relationship with Michael and his escape into science.
Yes.
So knowing that, it was like we prop for the science object and we cast a little boy, and, you know, and Rick is always, you know, when he's in location, he and Buddy are always like, they would see the windows, they would see the door, and, you know, the lights and shadow would just, they're very intuitive that way to capture the detail. And the lab work, the door slamming, the, you know, that sitting in the hallway reading, you know, when I saw that shot, I was really just blown away. So
Yes.
it's those were not necessarily pre-scripted, but were definite ideas that they wanted to capture. And,
Right.
you know, once in location, it's like the neurons, the synapses just go off and they just do it. You know,
Right. The places on the objects create
Right.
the inspiration, essentially.
And that was actually in Oliver's childhood home. I don't know if that's clear to everyone, but
Yes.
that home still exists. We visited ourselves, and the stained glass windows that he remembered as a little boy are still there. the doors and the ceiling moldings still there. So they were able to actually film in the home that he grew up in, which is amazing.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Were the lab objects still there, Shan, or were those things that,
No,
that
they-
Rick
they-
brought in? He brought them in?
They were propped. So
Right,
they
okay, I
were
gotcha.
found, yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Well, they're just absolutely gorgeous selections, and I just I was so blown away by the way in which Rick and Buddy filmed them, because
Right.
the beauty of them, along with the track and the story that's being told, was, it just had so much impact.
Yeah.
Um,
Rick and
the-
Buddy are really great at this racking focus, just being out of focus, and the slow dreaminess of coming back in or going back out. And
Yes.
they love doing that, and I love working with it. It's
Yeah.
just
It's
so
sort of like evokes memory,
right.
a cinematic equivalent to memory, which is exactly what Oliver is writing about.
Yes, exactly. No, it's definitely a reflection of that, very much so. So it just works stylistically in the film. It works beautifully with the subject, for sure. It's a perfect marriage, I think. Let's go. If we could go on from there. Dr. Sacks's first real breakthrough in neuroscience and as a writer was his work with patients with encephalitis lethargica, or sleepy sickness. Let's look at this clip about the awakenings first, and then let's talk a little bit about that afterwards.
Sure.
All right. Can we do clip number 3, Jason?
It had been established in the late 1950s that the Parkinsonian brain was deficient in the transmitter dopamine. And I wondered whether L-Dopa could help my own very different patients. The license to use L-Dopa took several months to come. And it was not until March of 1969 that I embarked on a double-blind trial with 6 patients, putting 3 on L-Dopa.
And suddenly there's this incredible flowering.
There was a thrilling beginning, an exhilarating beginning, and everyone shared this exhilaration. We were all a bit manic and euphoric. And within a few weeks, the effects of L-Dopa were clear and spectacular. And I decided to offer L-Dopa to every patient.
I once asked one of his patients, "Do you remember when you first came to?" And she said, "Oh yes," very quietly. Suddenly, I was talking. And I said, "Do you remember your first words after not having been there for 30 years? What were your first words?" She said. I said, "Phew, I'm talking."
And after her awakening in 1969, Rose
Again, I'm so Dr. Sacks talks about having a tape recorder and shooting some great films, but the amount of footage of the patients at Beth Abraham and the documentation of all of these different patients and actually getting to see some of the beginnings of the awakenings, that he witnessed himself was equally thrilling for me as an audience. Li-Shin, was there tons of this material to go through available to you in putting it together?
There was actually quite a bit, but they were sort of really not organized in any manner. So I had to really, I remember deciphering, oh, that's that person. Let me, organize it so that every person's sort of evolution as Oliver filmed them over time were at least together, so that when I want to reach for Rose, I have kind of every iteration of her from, and her deterioration and so on and so forth. And the sources were, there was also a documentary made in the 70s. So there was some combination of footage. But it was kind of, there is that chart of the patient's names. It was actually a chart that was made by Ren Weschler. So it was actually a chart that I used to try to figure out who was who. And so that I would, use them properly.
Right, I know.
Correctly.
Isn't the fun of detective work with unorganized footage such a blast for an editor? Do you feel the same way as I do, Li-Shin, when I have to do that?
Yeah, no, I think it's probably, Billy, it's probably very similar to you organizing photographs, and also I have to say Billy organizing all of Oliver's book and what he discovered in the books. It's for me. The organization is, you start to have almost a relationship with the footage. You learn about them, you kind of discover little things, and a flash there or a flick there becomes something that then you can take advantage of, leading for creating fluidity or, contrast or, kind of evoking the feelings that you want.
Yeah, no, exactly.
Yeah.
And also a great way to do a bit of visual storytelling, because you recognize Rose so much throughout the sequence, and you can see her progress and also see her subsequent deterioration. Could we talk a little bit about that? Actually, it's the awakenings themselves seem to be, an amazing bit of pioneering work for Dr. Sachs. And yet, disappointingly, it wasn't a total success. After the sequence that I chose, then he shows that the patients started to have side effects to L-DOPA that created problems for them, to the point where one of the patients started to call it Hell-DOPA. Because his physical symptoms, physical reactions were so bad, and consequently, Dr. Sachs had to pull back on this treatment, and he was criticized for it by some scientists, which I think led to this problem of him not being recognized in the world of neuroscience in quite the way in which he had wanted, he would have liked to have been. But Billy, maybe you can address this. I mean, knowing Dr. Sachs, can you kind of tell us where the opinion on this breakthrough with L-DOPA and these catatonic patients, where does it stand kind of in the history of neuroscience? How is it recognized now?
Well, the criticism, I think, was not so much about the failure of L-DOPA to keep the patients awakened and alive. The criticism was that there was a suspicion that Oliver had embellished, that L-DOPA had really, in fact, awakened them, that they'd come out of their sleepy sickness and had, in fact, spoken and danced and walked. That was the criticism, really, from fellow neurologists. There was a suspicion that he was making some of this up. But in fact, he wasn't, and he was completely honest about how the drug didn't succeed in keeping patients conscious and healthy and back to themselves in the way that he hoped and that they had hoped. So it was an examination of a drug that was perhaps being sort of overhyped.
Yeah.
And, that's where I think that's the rub, and where he was sort of ignored and sidelined because of that. But, medical articles that he wrote rejected, where he was reporting these side effects of L-Dopa because colleagues didn't exactly believe him.
Right. Did he never try to make use of the film footage and the recordings to kind of show people what had been achieved? He just didn't use them. It was only through writing that he was trying to get these discoveries across.
I'm not exactly sure if he used the film footage, but I do think it says so much about Oliver Sacks that he bought that Super 8 movie camera or 8mm camera, whatever it was, home movie camera, and was taking footage.
Yes.
It's so typical of him, in the Oliver Sacks archive, which is enormous.
Yeah.
Like 95,000 letters, 700 handwritten journals, hundreds of footage of film, every draft of every essay of every book that he ever wrote. From an early age, Oliver did have a sense intuitively, and not self-consciously or pretentiously, but some sense intuitively that what he was doing, that there was some sense of his own destiny. The very fact that going back to the 1950s, he was saving copies of his own letters, carbon copies of his own letters, and of course letters that he would receive back. And now have all of those in his archive, along with the film footage, the journals, and other material, which has helped to make this film so rich, and the history of Oliver and his work so rich.
Yeah, exactly. But just to go back for a moment to the criticism, but in substance, when Dr. Sacks's reputation has grown, have neuroscientists actually gone back and look at the Awakening's experiences with L-Dopa and look at them in a different light and realized more for what they did achieve?
I think so. And I think he was a man, a neurologist ahead of his time in so many ways. Recognized now in a certain way as almost like the father of what's now called the neurodiversity movement, although he did not coin that term neurodiversity, but recognizing that there's a whole spectrum to human behavior and to neurodiversity. So I think the recognition came late, and it was very satisfying for him, and contributed to his sort of sense of peace at the last stages of his life.
Right, exactly. Yeah, I gotcha. Yeah. Back to just a quick film question for Li Xin. Watching the film, another stylistic quirk to me is that it's Dr. Sacks telling this whole story, and then friends of his who fill in the gaps and respond to different parts of it. But it seems like Rick avoided interviewing anybody who was critical of Dr. Sacks, who had a kind of opposite opinion of him or his work. And I wondered if that was a conscious decision on Rick's part. Did he want to keep the film so much kind of in the kind of personal autobiography vein that he didn't want to interject the flow of that with kind of negative voices? I was just curious.
I think it was definitely an issue that we were struggling with. I think we had gathered and done all the interview, and editing was well underway, and realized that, well, this is clearly, something that we, I think, unintentionally had not covered, and tried to find a way to still reveal the fact that it wasn't smooth writing for him.
Yes.
All the way, and that there were extreme pushback. So we just tried to find hopefully effectively enough from the material and the people we interviewed enough to kind of convey that.
Yeah, I gotcha. Oh, actually, it does come across. It's between Dr. Sachs's own writings and some of the comments of some of his friends
Right.
that the negative issues do come up. So it's definitely there present in the film. But I was just struck by the fact that there wasn't, Rick just said, no, we're not going to bring in some kind of strong negative voice to I think it would have interrupted the vibe, to be honest with you, in terms of the way that the film it flows emotionally, to have that kind of voice. So I was just curious about that.
I think, though, that some of that criticism is aired in the film. It's expressed.
Yes.
I don't think he shied away from it.
No.
Right before this webinar, I watched a webinar with Kate Edgar, Oliver's longtime assistant, the great writer, surgeon Atul Gawande. And I was struck about how Atul Gawande, who's such a magnificent writer, really sees Oliver as such an important influence. And there are so many other writers like him. So that criticism of Oliver, quote unquote, exploiting his patients, I think is very much less strong than it might have once been.
Yes.
That he introduced a whole kind of new genre of narrative medicine for the 20th century. There was a kind of narrative medicine in the 19th century that Oliver especially loved, and that was common and popular in the 19th century. But Oliver revived that tradition of the case history and narrative medicine in the 20th century. Yeah. And so I was very struck by Atul Gawande talking about himself and Abraham Verghese and Jerome Groopman and others, many others who have followed in Oliver's footsteps.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, very much so. I'd like to do another clip now. It's actually maybe my favorite clip from the film. It combines a wonderful cinema verite scene with some astute interview observations. So if we could play that next clip, Jason, it's clip number 4.
Hi, Yolanda. The Jello is particularly good today.
What are you thinking?
I did tell you what I'm thinking. Oh, right. Okay, I will. Time was. It doesn't occur now, but it used to occur until a few years ago when I would wake up at night with an erection. This sort of erection has actually nothing to do with sexual excitement. It sometimes goes with a need to empty one's bladder, probably sometimes just with the autonomic stimulation which goes with dreams. And it was sometimes irritatingly persistent. And I would sometimes cool my turgid penis in orange Jello. Now, I knew I shouldn't have said it. It does say something.
He was a man of the extremes.
Yes.
He was immoderate in all possible directions. He was one of the most childlike friends I ever met. In that end, up to the very last day, I think.
Beautiful mother baby.
In some ways, he was so separate from the physical world. Sometimes not in tune with his own body. But he seemed to feel an affinity somehow, a need to embody others, to physically act out what he was talking about. Some people felt he had Tourette syndrome because he could rarely mention Tourette without ticking himself. In a sort of very sympathetic way, he found these ways to identify with all kinds of people, whether they were Nobel physicists or brilliant literary people, or the most compromised patient in a hospital bed, sometimes even a person who couldn't speak. He would imagine himself into them. He had some unconscious way of sensing this. That was the reason he was able to revive the tradition of the case history at a time in the late 20th century when case histories were in disfavor because everyone wanted science and statistics and quantitative medicine. Oliver made the case always for qualitative medicine, writing, description, observation, sympathy, and imagination.
In spending as much time with the patients as he spent with them,
first of all, I don't know, Li Xin, if I had been watching the dailies and I saw the erection scene, I would have said, that's going to be in the film. Did you have the same reaction?
Yeah, well, I knew about it even before I watched the dailies.
Oh, okay.
Rick came back right away and was telling the entire office, like, it's an amazing thing. We have to work it into the film. And of course, you know, it's what I mean about Oliver's wittiness, his quirkiness, his forthrightness, and it's just like everything is, life,
Right.
everything is filled with life,
Yes.
and should be and could be shared.
Yes,
And
exactly.
But I think that also I think that does have something to do, or a lot to do, with Rick and your whole team. I mean, think about it. This is also a man who was famously very, very shy.
Yes.
Suddenly, there's a whole filmmaking team within his apartment.
Uh-huh.
But he trusted Rick immediately, and
Right.
the whole crew was so discreet and gracious and so good at their jobs.
Uh-huh.
They just kind of disappeared into the background, and so you see Oliver just being himself as he was with friends. And
Yes.
it was, I think, unintentional. This whole thing was so spontaneous, but how perfect to have Oliver surrounded by people he loved and friends and family and colleagues. Each day maybe a couple of new people would come in, a couple of people would drop out, and he was surrounded by people he trusted. And also, I think importantly, this is very Oliver, by the things he loved. So his piano, his books, his fern and cactuses and other plants, his minerals and elements that he could show off. So he was very much in his element. And I've been thinking about how this film would never have worked if you had filmed Oliver in a studio, for example.
Yes, exactly.
To come into the apartment, a place where he was just so comfortable
Mm-hmm.
in his element, to use that word again, and then to have this very discreet and amazing film crew just observe and film him as he talked. The anecdote about the Jell-O, which I had heard several times before, but I was surprised when it came out, and yet not surprised because he was so comfortable and at that point.
Yeah, exactly.
Anything
Well, I think it's one of the great hallmarks of cinema verite film is when the filmmakers achieve that level of trust and comfort with the subject, so that basically anything can happen, and the person or people being filmed just feel totally comfortable to reveal whatever happens to be going on at the moment. I mean, it's a hallmark of great cinema verite filmmaking.
Yeah.
And I'm so happy you put it in the film because it comes at a wonderful moment too. You kind of need a comment. But then what you did, Li Xin, then to follow that up with the comments by Kate about the empathy he has and the orangutan scene, which, right after the orangutan scene, to go to the orangutan scene, which is again, it's just that little section is so beautiful. I mean, it's just watching him look at the orangutans and imitating their movements and reaching his hand out to touch their hands through the glass, as Kate describes the kind of empathy that he tried to establish, not just with patients, but even to imply it with animals. It just says so much about him and about his methodology as a neuroscientist who is as interested in the individuality of the patient, patient's being as anything that's more clinical. It comes across so strongly. And then Kate goes on, to make the point about, the loss kind of the use of case history in late 20th century science and early 21st century science, that Oliver really helped to revive, which I think is a nice thread that runs beautifully through the film. It's developed very, very clearly, and Kate's comment there is perfect for following up that line. In terms of that decision to juxtapose the cinema verite Jello scene with the orangutan and the case histories, was that something that you and Rick talked about deliberately in terms of juxtaposition that would be so revealing about two sides of Oliver's character? Or
Right. I think it was, we were just totally mesmerized by the footage, and, it just seemed like a perfect match to what Kate was saying. And I think it just seemed like the right moment, in the arc of the film to have that seemingly jarring switch.
Yeah.
But in fact, they kind of resonate so well with each other.
Yes, they do. Yes. Right.
Yeah.
Billy, could you comment a little bit about the case histories? Again, it's his love of that 19th century historical scientific tradition,
Right.
that he really did help to revive in a tremendous way through his work and through his books.
Yeah.
Do you want to talk a little bit about that, and in terms of that being one of his great contributions to modern neuroscience?
Well, one thing I think it's important to remember is that both of his parents were physicians and also great storytellers. So he grew up in a family and over a dinner table where they would tell stories about the patients they had seen that day. His dad was a sort of general practitioner. His mother was one of the first female surgeons in England and a very brilliant surgeon. And so he kind of grew up on these medical stories about patients told with great empathy, but also wit and a sort of narrative sense. And then as a reader, he was a voracious reader, I can tell you for sure, because I sorted his entire library, which was in this apartment of 10,000 books. Everything from Sherlock Holmes stories to science fiction to botany and Darwin and Freud.
Right.
I think Freud had a certain influence on him. He may not have agreed with Freud's theories, but the way Freud could tell a story about his patients in his own case histories certainly had an influence.
Yeah.
19th century neurologists and psychiatrists. So I think it was a very natural progression for him. On the other hand, he was also very aware of trying to protect his patients' privacy and to make sure they were comfortable with him telling their stories, and of course, hiding any identifying details if they wished.
Right.
But I think it was a very natural progression for him.
Mm-hmm.
Although it evolved over time. His first book was called Migraine, and it's a much more kind of medically, kind of a more traditional medical book. It's quite dense, followed by Awakenings, where you read these profiles of these amazing patients. And as the work goes on, and there are so many books at this point, I think 16,
yeah,
they become even more sophisticated and in greater depth. Perhaps books like An Anthropologist on Mars, where he wrote his famous case study of Temple Grandin, the woman, scientist who is also autistic. And that first appeared as a profile in the New Yorker. And really, in a certain way, autism, of course, was already known, but surfaced this idea of people with autism not being bizarre or disabled in any way, but just being different and interesting in certain ways and having a deep inner life. And he was able to do that by getting to know Temple Grandin so well.
Right, exactly. Yeah.
Which was Temple's contributions in the film are wonderful. And what she
you bring her up at the perfect moment, because my next clip actually is one with Temple. Jason, can you play? It's clip number 5, and then we'll talk about it after.
Oliver was an observer. That's why Oliver didn't get respect from the science community. See, some people think that you have to have a hypothesis and a controlled experiment to have science. And I say, okay, what is astronomy then? The Hubble Space Telescope just looks at things. It's observation. Observation is part of science, because without observation, you couldn't even make up a hypothesis. What Oliver did is sort of like the Hubble Space Telescope of neurology. It's astronomy of the mind.
One theme we talked a lot about was the hard problem, consciousness. Consciousness, which concerned him totally in his writings. He was obsessed. He was obsessed with that, as, by the way, every serious scientist is by now.
Much of my life has been spent trying to understand the relation of brain and mind, in particular, the biological basis of consciousness.
Consciousness ultimately is experience. The essential core of consciousness is the fact that it feels like something from the inside to be a conscious being. What does it feel like to be me? What does it feel like to be you? What's the exact relationship between the body, in particular the brain, because we know it's the brain that gives rise to conscious experience, and our experience? And Oliver always expressed this sense of wonderment that literally every day I wake up in a world of color and sound and fury, and it feels like a miracle. And he never lost that sense of wonder.
Paul, you may be muted again.
Sorry. It's old age, forgive me. I'm sorry. I was just saying it was a great little section that has a wonderful trajectory between Temple's comments and the astronomy of the mind, and then into Roberto's talking about how the subject of consciousness is really has risen again in the field of neuroscience, to be followed by Christoph Koch's great comment about retaining that sense of wonder. It's so great to have Temple in the film, and that particular moment again just jumped out at me because of her defense of him, of this put down about just being an observer and not being a real scientist, which he was working so hard to turn around that perception and really did achieve, I think, in his later career for sure. Either one of you want to comment about that?
Well, I love what she has to say. It's one of the greatest descriptions of Oliver Sacks I've ever heard or read. He's
yes,
an astronomer of the mind.
Right.
So wonderful. I wish I had been there when they filmed Temple. And in fact, actually, I've never met Temple, but I've heard plenty of stories. I know there was great love and affection between them, and respect.
Sure.
And Rick and the crew really captured that in the interview with Temple, which is very, very special and important. It comes at such a perfect moment in the film, I think.
Yes, it does, very much so.
That very beautiful, dreamy sequence about consciousness. Maybe Li-Shin can talk about that. That's so amazing and beautiful.
Yeah, actually, I did want to ask you, Li-Shin, the conception that Rick and Buddy had about the Bethesda Fountain sequence. It's so fascinating to me. Which you then wind up turning into partly into an animation for some of the later material. But where did that idea come up with? Where Rick came up with that idea for that sequence?
Well, it was very much, Rick really worked with an amazing animation team, for later on as this particular thing evolves. You see, we wanted to try to. It came out from conversation about, well, how do we show what's actually going on inside the mind of people with these neurodiversities.
Right.
So then it's like, okay, how do you depict it externally and internally? So the animation was try to find the representation of potentially what is going on in the brain, and that the team really kind of got the up-to-date research of what the neurons look like and how they move, and so all of that was fairly accurate. And then, okay, so we talked about, well, what could be going on for a person with migraine, which is that woman, and sort of the reaction to sight and sound and all of that. And just thinking, well, partly because Bethesda Fountain is just down the street from the office, so it was an easy location and a beautiful location. Yes. And when we scouted, we saw that Mr. Balloon making magical guy, and just thought that it was a wonderful visual kind of representation of kind of, in the brain, outside the brain, what's going on, the visual quality. So we kind of, nabbed the guy, and he worked with us. To kind of put that all together. So the skater worked with us. We had, there's a mother with a stroller, and the woman with the migraine were all kind of choreographed in that scene. Right.
The bubble blow, the blowing the bubbles in front of the woman's face. Again, it was a great idea. And do you have any recollection of how that came about? Those images?
Well, it was, Rick having seen the guy, and just during a scout, and just made sure the guy was going to be there, and he definitely wanted he wanted to film through it, add it, and definitely wanted it to be part of a motif in the scene. And when you look at the dailies, it's just like, it's beautiful. You cannot not use it, So anytime you could. Use it as a tonal thing, as a transitional thing. It's mesmerizing. It kind of draws you in. It kind of makes you feel like the brain is happening. Stuff is going on.
Right. A wonderful representation of the internal and external.
Right.
Yeah, exactly. Jason, you're going to try to stop us. Can I do one more clip, please, please, please? Please.
Do you want to do one more clip and a goodbye clip, or one more goodbye clip?
No, one more clip that we can talk about, and then I can give you a goodbye clip.
Okay.
Is that a deal?
You got it.
Okay. Then what I would like to do is to skip ahead. Let's play clip number 7, and then we'll talk a bit about it after.
As an editor, that I've had this association with you, and I feel like this is just one of the finest books you've ever written.
This is the first one, hot off the press. And with my sexy picture on the cover.
Until his late 70s, I think an enormously long stretch of his life was a very eloquent, careful groping for respect. And then Billy came along.
In 2008, Oliver and I had this little correspondence, and I'd paid a couple of visits on my trips to New York. But I didn't know he was gay. And it wasn't until I moved here and we began to see more of each other that we developed a relationship. I think, in a way, as unexpected for me as for him, Oliver had lived this very solitary life and not had any long-term relationships.
We started to go out together, often to the New York Botanical Garden, which I had visited alone for more than 40 years. It has been a great and unexpected gift in my old age, after a lifetime of keeping at a distance.
I remember early on, he took me for a walk at the New York Botanic Garden in the Bronx. And he started telling me about his love of ferns. And I asked him why, and he said, ferns are survivors. And that was his theme, survival. It was the theme of the Awakenings patients, their survival, which was so incredible and moving, and which he had so much to do with. And at the end of his life, in a way, his own survival, and articulating that and looking back on it.
It was amazing for him, clearly, but it was amazing to see someone in his late 70s fall crazily in love and solve such a deep problem that he had. Somebody finally told him, you can love, you can connect, and therefore you can begin to complete this struggle you've made. And the last 4 years, I think, felt
Oh, man.
Yeah. Oh, Billy.
Billy!
How do you think that feel? Oh my God.
Yeah, right. It's just, you know, I have to say, as a gay man, I found the developing love story in the film so moving. You know, it's, you know, Dr. Sax's struggle with his sexuality, you know, his father's partial acceptance, his mother calling him an abomination, you know, falling in love with Mel, you know, renouncing his sexuality, becoming celibate for 35 years. And then at the end of his life, finding you. I mean, it's a wonderful through line in the film that, you know, just personally as a gay man, it's very, very moving to me to see that happen for Dr. Sax, for sure. And again, you know, to Rick and Li Xin's credit, you know, the beautiful way in which that part of Oliver's story was told, I think, was done with great grace and elegance throughout, and a great honesty, I think. And to come to that wonderful conclusion, which I was sort of suspicious because of all of your little appearances in the film, Billy, but then to finally have it revealed at the end was a great joy. It really was. I mean, it was just, I was very happy for Dr. Sax, very happy for you. And I think the audience feels the same way when they watch the film. To see a gay individual in the struggle they have to go through to have that be accepted and be a part of their life is really quite moving.
It's so beautifully handled, and you know, there's so many levels to this film, so many stories in the story, and that one just does kind of creep up on you. I mean, just watching that just now just made me so choked up.
I'm sure.
Just so discreet and elegant, and very, very Oliver. It was just perfect.
Right.
So,
right.
Yeah.
Yeah. And Li Xin, it's beautifully put together. It really is. I mean, it's, you know, and just another quick comment about your and Rick's team is Brian Keene's music throughout the film is so, his compositions are so perfect in almost every single sequence. And there's a tone and a quality to them that fit the film in an amazing, amazing way. And Brian is, again, a collaborator that Rick has worked with for years and years and years from the early days. I mean, I remember working with him on Coney Island, which was Rick's first kind of solo film. So it's wonderful, that continuity of collaborators that Rick has throughout his life. It's really a striking part of his filmmaking.
Yeah, I think this project, you know, you were mentioning how it stretched Rick and I into a different genre almost, you know, kind of hybrid genre. And I think it's same way with music. the way in which, we actually went down to Brian's studio a few times, just kind of finding, he would throw out like really outrageous ideas, and it would work. May not always work at the place that he had in mind, but it would just like, I think we're all on the same vibe as to what we want this, the tone and the emotion of the story to come through.
Yes,
and
exactly.
He did an amazing job.
Yes, yeah. Well, I think we should end it. But I really thank you, Li Xin and Billy Hayes for stepping in for Rick. I think it was wonderful to talk to both of you, and I think that I hope the audience got a lot out of this conversation, as well as I hope they liked the film as much as I do, for sure. And as an exit clip, Jason, if you want to play clip number 6, which goes back a little bit to the Bethesda fountain sequence, but the audience will get to see a little bit more about how that was utilized in terms of animation. But thank you all very much for participating this evening.
Yeah, thank you all, and I just want to say Rick really sends his very best, and wish he could be here with you guys. But
yes, well,
thank you for having us.
Same from me to him, and I hope everything works out okay.
Will do.
This
Thank
does
you.
not preclude us from having Rick back. I know Rick loves Santa
Oh, he
Fe.
would love it.
So we will keep an open invitation to Rick, because
Great.
it's always great to talk to him. And,
Yes.
And he is a deeply, the spiritual element of the story I know flows through him. So
Yes.
I want to thank you, Li Xin, for not just for joining us tonight, for all the work you're doing to bring these stories to light over years and years. Thank you, Billy Hayes, for all that you do to keep Oliver's legacy alive, because those stories are eternal. And Paul, again, thank you for doing such a good job of shepherding this conversation. I know we just scratched the surface.
Yeah, I know.
We didn't get to all of your questions, everybody, but thank you so much for being here with us. We have a bunch of great programs coming up. Paul will be back with us on October 9th for a program with Ali McGraw celebrating the 19th Amendment, which is we had a live presentation of it. The Alice Paul flag is behind him proudly. Could not be a better moment to share that story. On Sunday, we've got an incredible documentary filmmaker, Kirsten Johnson, will be showing her film Camera Person. She'll be in conversation with David Wilson of the True False Film Festival. And then we've got more programs coming. I'm not going to even list them all. Just go to the website. It's all kinds of great stuff, and we're so grateful for Santa Fe joining us every week. We'll go out with this clip. If you like what you saw and you would like to contribute, click on the offers tab, and it'll open up in a new browser, and then you can send a little money to CCA to keep these programs strong. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. Here is our goodbye clip. When this clip is over, we're going to end the evening, and we'll see you next time. Thanks again.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Something which Crick and I spoke about right at the very beginning was that in attacks of migraine, sometimes the sense of movement would disappear, and you would see a series of stills, like stroboscopic illumination or film run too slow.
This particular type of migraine, suddenly this sense of continuity is shattered, and you see the world only as discrete frames.
I found myself wondering whether the apparently continuous passage of time and movement given to us by our eyes was an illusion. Whether in fact our visual experience consisted of a series of timeless moments which were then welded together by some higher mechanism in the brain. I called it cinematic vision, and Crick was very, very interested in this.
Of course, that's exactly what happens in a movie. If you take something at 24 or 30 frames, each frame is a static frame, yet we all see continuous motion. But patients have what's called ekinetopsia, an absence of seeing motion. They typically have bilateral lesions here in the back of the brain, and to them the world looks like individual stills, like a strobe light, but they don't see continuous motion. And that tells us that there's some relationship between specific parts of the brain and particular aspects of consciousness. That there is a particular part of the brain that's just responsible for seeing the sense of motion. So this illusion of motion is revealed to be what it is, an illusion. In fact, what the underlying reality are discrete frames. That tells us something that may reveal the way actually we perceive motion in particular, and maybe the sense of time in general, the flow of time. That is an interesting question that people now ask. What are the mechanisms in our brain that lead us to perceive duration and flow of time? And that all came out of these observations by Oliver.